All right. For week 3 Tuesday, we're moving forward in time a bit from 1776 to 1863. So today we're going to be looking at the Gettysburg Address, and I will be reading it in sections, but if you would like a comprehensive reading, I have a link to this YouTube video where Johnny Cash reads the Gettysburg Address aloud. And Johnny Cash has a lovely voice, and he plays some really nice, guitar in the background. So it's very pleasant. So if you would like to hear him read it first, then I will leave that option to you. Okay, so looking at my little presentation here. Dun, 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 dun. All right. So this first slide is actually the text of the Gettysburg Address, but it has been arranged into a word cloud. So word clouds, what they do is, they take the words of the Gettysburg Address and, sort of spread them all around into a big cloud-like shape. But the words that are larger are words that appear more frequently in the piece. So you can see, there's little words that are maybe only used once, like proposition. So that's a little one. War is a bit bigger, so it's probably said more than once. Conceived, around the same size. Great, even bigger. People, even larger. And then nation and dedicated. Those are very large, so you would expect to see those quite frequently. So I think it's an interesting way to look at a text because, obviously the words that are repeated more often are often more significant than the other ones. And obviously it's removed all little words, pronouns and conjunctions and things. So it's really boiling down to its essence. So if you were to look at this, you would probably think that this was a speech about dedication and a nation. And in a sense, it rather is. So let's look at the text of the Gettysburg Address. So I'll show you this picture first so that you can see the only documented photograph from that day in 1863. So this is Abe Lincoln. He's very, very blurry because, photography in 1863 was not at its peak, but that was him. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg lasted for 3 days in July of 1863. The speech was delivered in November of 1863, several months later. 51,000 lives were lost in that battle, obviously both sides together. So November 19th was the day that was set aside for the dedication of a cemetery at Gettysburg. And the crowds that gathered on the day of the dedication were enormous. 15 to 20,000 people gathered to hear this very blurry Abe Lincoln speak to them. Before Lincoln took the stage, there was another famous speaker, and he spoke passionately for 2 hours. The crowd became weary. The president was introduced, and he performed his consecration speech in about 3 minutes. So there's disagreement about whether there was applause or merely stunned silence, but the response was emotional and solemn. So Abraham Lincoln, who obviously was in the midst of a rather large war at the time, reportedly wrote the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope on a train on the way to the dedication ceremony. So it's kind of incredible that this speech, seemingly written, in such a hurry, delivered within 2 minutes, it's only 3 paragraphs long, really, has had such an impact and was so well written and well crafted. And Lincoln is very, very subtle about it, but he does have several persuasive purposes, rhetorical purposes, that he is trying to advance here. So typically, what I will have students do is to first try to translate the text of the Gettysburg Address. So, for example, in this first paragraph, 77 years ago. Well, offhand, unless you've read a lot of very old literature, you may not know exactly what 77 years ago means. But I will tell you that a score of years is 20 years. So 4 times 20, and 7, that will give us 87 years ago. So if you do some quick mental math and count backwards from 1863, 87 years ago would give you approximately 1776, the date of the Declaration of Independence. So, right from the get-go, Abe Lincoln is reminding us of the start of the nation. Okay, so this time, if you want to pause and try and do a little bit of kind of paraphrasing and translating and putting things in your own words, I do think it helps with overall understanding. But once you feel like you have, looked over the speech and you have a pretty good idea of what exactly is being said, then I'll kind of chime back in with some rhetorical analysis. So feel free to pause me at this time, and you can either use this little slideshow to look at the text of the Gettysburg Address, or you're welcome to Google it or something. Stick it in a Google Doc, do it in there. Doesn't matter to me, but I do want to make sure you have a good understanding of the Gettysburg Address before I start talking about it. So listen to it, read it, paraphrase, do whatever you need to do to get a good understanding of it. So pause now. Okay, so hopefully you paused and did something to acquaint yourself with the Gettysburg Address. If not, then hopefully you'll be able to follow along as I talk through the speech. So I went ahead and kind of translated the first part of this first line for you. 87 years ago, 87 years ago, in 1776, our fathers. So our, very unifying pronoun, trying to bring the whole crowd together. Fathers, the founding fathers who founded this nation all together, brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty. Now, the word conceived is an interesting choice here. So when we think of conception, it's often associated with birth. Like childbirth. So the fact that he says this nation was conceived in liberty from its very moment of creation and life, it was based on freedom. And it was dedicated, it was committed to the proposition that all men are created equal. So this first sentence gives us kind of the who, what, when, where, and why. So it's interesting that in dedicating a battlefield where people have died, Abe Lincoln starts off talking about the creation and inception of our country. So thinking about purpose, why is it important to remind all the people gathered here, the thousands of people who have gathered to hear him speak, why is it important to remind them about the birth of the nation? Okay, on to the second paragraph. Now we have a little time shift, so that word definitely signals we're kind of fast forwarding. So first paragraph, 1776. Now, in 1863, we are engaged in a great civil war. Now, pausing there for a moment, back in the day in 1863, this word did not necessarily mean what it means nowadays. So nowadays, if you say something is great, that's kind of the equivalent of saying it's awesome and good. But back in the day, it was common to refer to things of large size as great. So in this case, he's not saying like, hey, this civil war is great. It's not a flippant kind of tone, but, an impressive and ginormous and huge and all-encompassing civil war. So now we are engaged in this massive civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So when Lincoln starts talking about now, and he mentions we are testing whether this nation or any nation that was birthed the same way as us can actually last. So he's taking this civil war, which is affecting this nation, and reminding them that what is at stake here, it's not just our nation. We are a country that is built on the very ideals of freedom and democracy. The world is watching. If the world sees that democracy and freedom fall apart, then why would anyone try and do that? Why would any country try to embrace those ideals, obviously those ideals aren't viable. So he's reminding them it's not just our country that is at stake here. This is a test. And this is a test to see whether freedom and liberty are lasting solutions. Can a country actually embrace these and survive? Or does it just all fall apart without a king or a dictator or somebody lording over everything and having control over everyone's lives? So, just a little subtle reminder there that this war is important, and we are fighting this war for more than just our nation. Okay, and then changes tack again. He's moving very quickly through different ideas here. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. Ooh. So definitely could have just ended the sentence after lives. These people gave their lives. These people died. But this last little bit here, that that nation might live. So with conception, with the word live, it's almost as if America is a living being. And if this war tears apart the nation dies. The idea of a nation based on freedom dies. So by personifying our entire country, it does make it seem like we're losing more if we allow, the South and the North to indeed separate. That the very, living embodiment of freedom, our nation, will pass away and just, won't work. So, it is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. We definitely should honor these soldiers who were trying to fight to keep our nation alive. Okay, and then big old third paragraph here. Okay, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. And I want you to note in this sentence the parallelism. So the way that he's using the subject and verb of the sentence repeatedly to emphasize what he's saying here. Could have just said, we cannot dedicate, consecrate, or hallow this ground. The repetition of we cannot is not grammatically necessary for any reason. But Lincoln really wants to emphasize that the people who are gathered here are unable to make amends for what happened to these men unless, and he's kind of winding us up for the unless here. So even though it is proper that we are here to dedicate this place, that is the purpose of this ceremony, of this gathering here to dedicate this ground. Even though we are here to do that, we can't really be the one to do it because the brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. So the word consecrate is an interesting word, and if you did end up paraphrasing this, I hope that you kind of looked it up to understand exactly what it meant. Consecrate has religious connotations. It is to make something sacred. So Lincoln is saying that, this ceremony here, this ceremony does not make this ground sacred. The men who died, their death, their sacrifice have already made this land sacred. Okay. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. Ironic, considering we're just studying the speech, but whatever. But it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so far nobly advanced. Aha! Now he's starting to get his true purpose out here. So yes, we're here to dedicate the cemetery, we're here to honor the men who died, but if we want to honor them, if we truly want to honor them, we have to be dedicated. We have to be committed to the cause that they fought for. They were fighting to try to preserve the life of our nation, to try to bring our nation together. So we need to continue that. Keep in mind that 1863, this is not the end of the war. This is the middle of the war. And let me tell you, there were a lot of people in the North who did not support this war, who said, you know what, if the Southern states want to secede, let them. Get rid of them. Bunch of whiners anyways. So this war, which took so many lives, was massively unpopular in 1863. And Lincoln is trying to use this moment where he is dedicating this field to the soldiers who died to say, do you want them to have died for no reason? Do you really want all of the men, the fathers and the brothers that you have lost? Do you really want them to have died for nothing? They had a task. They had work here that they were doing. And we are cheapening their deaths. We are removing the sacredness of their deaths if we do not continue that. So, it is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause. You'll note he never actually says, fighting the war. That cause, unfinished work. The people know what it is. That cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. They did not die for nothing. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. So, first birth, 1776. New birth, now. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Again, reminding them that democracy as an ideal, it is not to be found around the world. And if our democracy fails, you can probably guess that not many other countries are going to embrace it as a, serious possibility for the form of government that they want their country to take. So anyways, that's kind of the little minutia, the line-by-line stuff that Lincoln does to evolve his message. Subtly, sneakily. He's very, very well written. Now, a couple of things to point out, and you probably have already noted this because of the little word map that I gave you at the beginning, but there is an interesting repetition that Lincoln uses throughout his speech. And if you were just reading the speech, it's very sneaky. But if you look very carefully, how many times do you see the word dedicate or dedicated, some form of that word? So we got one here. Then in our second paragraph, we have two, we have three, and then in our last paragraph, we have four, we have five, and we have six. 6 times in 3 paragraphs, he uses the word dedicate or dedicated. And the meaning of it changes as we go along, as his, real purpose is being revealed. At first, dedicated uses it in the context of the birth of the nation, the beginnings, the conception. Then, dedicate changes a little bit, used in the context of dedicating the battlefield, consecrating, making holy, having a religious dedication. Then, finally, at the end, dedication is devotion. It is commitment to the cause, to this fight that a lot of people really didn't want to keep fighting for. So, just by tracing the evolution of that word, that element of diction, it reflects the purpose and the evolution of his purpose throughout the speech. Very sneaky, very subtle. Good job, Lincoln. And then another interesting thing when you're thinking about this speech is to think about the things that he didn't say. If I just tell you we're going to read a speech from the Civil War, from a northern president at a battlefield, words that you might think would come up: slave, slavery, North, South, soldier, Confederate, Union, win. Because Lincoln's goal here was not to win per se. I mean, like, yes, he did have to, quote unquote, defeat the Confederate armies in order to reunite the nation, but that really ultimately was the goal, to reunite the nation. So a speech that emphasized the division points of this nation, it wouldn't be effective. It wouldn't achieve its point. He doesn't want to draw attention to the things that separate the North and the South. He doesn't want to draw attention to their differences. He doesn't even want to label them as separate entities. You note that every time he talks about the men who died here, he never says the Union soldiers, the brave men. All of them, both sides, lumps them together in one big pot and says all of these men fought for this country, for this freedom, even though I can, be willing to bet that many of the Confederate ones probably weren't necessarily fighting for the unification of the nation. So Lincoln has an incredible challenge, possibly a greater challenge than any other president in U.S. history, which is to win a war in a way that doesn't completely trash the other side and somehow bring the nation together, rather than, separating them further. So it's an incredible challenge, and I think this speech is just one small example of the way that he did it. Never emphasize those division points. Emphasize what brings people together. And both sides could definitely agree, we want to dedicate this field to these honored dead. That is not a point of contention. So emphasize what brings us together rather than what divides us. All right. I think we have discussed Lincoln's speech very thoroughly. So this is your challenge now, and I have a better copy of that here underneath Week 3 Tuesday, last thing there. Okay, so in some sort of Google document thingy, I want you to tell me, just briefly, little paragraph here, what is the author's purpose in the Gettysburg Address? So, thinking about our space cat, you'll be addressing the P in space, purpose. So, what is Lincoln's purpose? And you are welcome to address other points of space, his exigence or context. As you're trying to explain the purpose, it may be necessary to address those things. So what is Lincoln's purpose in making the speech? Explain his purpose in a short paragraph, and please incorporate textual evidence from the Gettysburg Address. Now, when you use textual evidence, and this is absolutely something you will have to do on, at least 2 of the essays in the AP exam, but you want to try and incorporate quotes from the piece, from the text, in a way that is smooth and seamless. So I recommend trying to choose phrases rather than sentences. It's a little easier to incorporate shorter phrases into a response in a way that feels smooth and flows very well. And I also recommend trying to work it into the sentence itself. So rather than just kind of plopping it in between 2 other sentences, lead into it and out of it, so that it flows with the rest of what you're saying. So the 2 skills you'll be assessed on here: identifying author's purpose and incorporating textual evidence smoothly. Feel free to use as much textual evidence as you want, but, don't use more textual evidence than original writing. So there still should be a balance, a little bit of textual evidence to support what you're saying, not to replace what you're saying. Okay, I think that is all that I have here. So if you have any questions about the Gettysburg response, please let me know. But hopefully you now feel thoroughly educated about Lincoln and the brilliance of his envelope speech.